Let me cut right to the chase here. I really like Space Marines 2. It was a sequel I never really expected to be announced, let alone released, as the original title debuted in 2011, so seeing this game come out 13 years later is unexpected, but boy is it fun. It's a great callback to action games of old, and plenty of blood and violence and a fun gameplay loop that makes you just feel like you're taking the mantle of a character that can inflict huge amounts of damage to enemies and, well, basically you just are a walking tank. I won't go into a full review here of the game's quality, but I will say I really like it. I want to focus though on the performance that you can expect to get out of your PC. Now the footage I'll be showing you guys is going to be of the earlier parts of the game, so you won't get any heavy spoilers, so don't worry about that. Just to give you full disclosure, I was sent the review copy of the game for coverage, but of course all opinions of the game's performance are my own as well as whether I liked it or not. Briefly speaking of my setup, I'll be running an Intel i9-13900K with 48GB of RAM split across two sticks. They are Patriot 8200 MTS Extreme 5 DDR5 memory. There'll be a full review of that coming soon as well. For the OS, we're running Windows 11, and as for the GPU, well, there's going to be 3 different cards I'm going to be testing. An RTX 4090, a 4070, and finally a 3060 Ti, just to see how the game scales across different quality settings and resolutions. Now, I do want to get this out of the way, and the bad news is the game is definitely heavy CPU bound. There was a patch that was released during testing, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Basically, if you're running a card such as a 4090 with a 4K output with all of the settings maxed out, if you switch from Ultra Performance DLSS to Quality Mode, there is basically no difference in performance as the game is just CPU bound at most locations of my 13900K. Now I am running the latest BIOS, i.e. with Intel's fixes, but still I disabled boost limits for the processor, and even so, again, the CPU is definitely holding things back. I will look further into the different performance modes and DLSS quality in a moment, but let's first of all look at how the game scales on lower end cards. We'll start things out with the 3060 Ti, and unsurprisingly, this card just really can't run the game at 4K native with ultra quality settings without DLSS. If you enable DLSS quality mode, things do help a little bit. You can get somewhere in the 30 to low 40 FPS mark, and if you nudge the quality settings down to high, we get an extra 10 frames a second on average. I suspect the majority of RTX 3060 Ti owners though will be pairing their GPU with a display more in the region of 1440p. If that's the case, 60 FPS or above can be held in most scenarios if you enable quality DLSS with ultra settings for the graphics. Performance mode with DLSS helps crank performance up, of course. You're going to be achieving low 70s to low 80s, again with ultra settings enabled. Personally, if I were running a 1440p display with VRR and an RTX 3060 Ti class GPU, this is how I personally would recommend playing. What if you don't want DLSS? Well, this is where things get a little trickier. You're going to be getting around mid 40 FPS, possibly a little less, high 30s, and this is going to be essentially mirroring the same performance as you would get with 4K DLSS. Now, depending on the location, as I said, you can get between low to mid 40 with ultra settings, but the visual quality settings don't make huge differences in performance. Even if you drop the textures to the lowest setting and everything else to max, it hasn't really improved hitching or the performance that I've personally experienced. If, however, you set everything to the high preset, well, that's going to poke the game in the ass and you're going to be getting around mid-50s, which again is definitely better, but it's not really what I would consider an optimal experience, so I still would recommend you enable FSR or DLSS to at the very least the quality setting. Well, what if you drop things further? What about medium? Well, then you get basically no difference in performance, just a couple of frames at best, and even low, again in the same scene, you're going to be getting around 58 frames a second, maybe just about touching 60, but again, it's certainly not consistent. You could argue that VRR makes it a little more palatable, but personally, from my own standpoint, I would much rather run the game with FSR or DLSS to quality and have the game set to high or ultra rather than be running the game at low and still not be achieving 60 FPS. The RTX 4070 has significantly more compute it can push against Space Marines 2, and while again native 4K is just too ambitious, high 20s to low 30s at Ultra running with a 4K native output, but if you run with DLSS set to quality and high settings, you can generally manage to squeeze somewhere in the north of 60 FPS. If you crank DLSS to performance, well, things are much better even with Ultra settings enabled, hanging to deal life between mid-70s to 80s depending on the scene. Switching to high instead gets us very close to 100 FPS, but oftentimes you're not going to be able to quite make it. For those with 1440p screens though, even with Ultra settings, we're able to get low 100 frames per second with DLSS set to quality. So in short, if you're running an RTX 4070 class card in raster performance, remember Space Marines 2 doesn't natively support hardware-based ray tracing, then you're going to see the game very manageable for 4K displays with a few concessions, and 1440p being not so challenging at all, as you would expect. Okay, but what if you're running an RTX 4090? With all of the settings set to Ultra, a 4K native, you're going to be getting between 70 and 80 FPS, and it's very achievable to maintain those frame rates. If we enable DLSS to quality setting, you'll be getting a close lock to 120 Hz, again depending on the scene. Just to reiterate, however, if you switch to lower screen resolutions, for example 1440p, or if you choose to enable, say, performance DLSS modes, you're not going to get that much additional frame rate because, again, the game is just so CPU dependent. Space Marines 2 does offer AMD's FSR2 as well as DLSS 2 and UE's TSR. Unfortunately, there's no frame generation in the game, which is kind of a shame because I think it would be kind of helpful given how CPU bound the game is, but again, it may not be that important to you if you've got an RTX 4090 because you're going to be getting such high frame rates anyway, but if you were to have a lower end RTX 40 card or perhaps an AMD based GPU, and it would be nice for FSR3 for example to be incorporated, but right now anyway, frame generation just is not supported. So just how CPU bound is the game? Well, let's again look at the RTX 4090. Running the game with a 4K output and DLSS or FSR, it just doesn't improve performance at all between quality and ultra. Remember, quality mode renders the game internally at 1440p, and ultra performance is 720p for a 3x scale. Either way, you're going to be dancing around 120 to 130 FPS, depending what's going on. There was also a patch which dropped during the middle of my testing, which amongst other things did improve CPU performance a little. To further this, there also seemed to be some improvements in the visual quality on low settings, particularly when it comes to the muddier looking textures on the ground. Now the difference is fairly subtle, and of course it doesn't apply to everything, but I would say that the difference is still pretty stark between low and medium settings. So personally I would say that unless you really need those extra frames, I would suggest sticking to medium at the least. The performance however is also improved decently on both low and medium settings compared to the pre-patch. Now as you probably spotted however, going from medium to high improved frame rates between low 80s to about 90 FPS, whereas pre-patch there was essentially zero performance difference between medium and high, even if you were using DLSS. Believe me, that was a bit of a head scratcher. I actually tested this multiple times with a few reboots because I was convinced I was doing something wrong, but no, it was the case. So it was kind of an odd one, so it's nice to see that that's been patched, and I'm sure there'll be further patches to boot. Now, let's keep on the subject of quality for just a few more moments. If we switch the highest quality texture settings, Ultra, with a card with 12GB or less RAM, you're going to get a warning sign that you don't have enough memory. I also briefly tested this with an RTX 2080 Ti and it also threw up the warning. Of course that card has 11GB. The game would still run and accept the settings, and honestly I didn't really notice any additional stutter on the cards that I ran the testing with, but that's certainly not an endorsement. Your mileage will probably vary. Frankly, dropping the textures from ultra to high and it doesn't trigger the warning is not exactly a chasm in quality difference, so I would personally suggest high if you're at all concerned. So what about the processor itself then? Well, I've mentioned multiple times at this stage that the game has been somewhat CPU bound. I've heard some folks have had some joy disabling E-cores on their Intel processors to improve performance, but for me anyway, it fell within the margin of error, with the E-cores being enabled coming out slightly ahead. I did notice perhaps some improvements with hyperthreading disabled, along with the E-cores being disabled, but again, it was kind of margin of error improvement, so I wouldn't really say it's worth rebooting your system just for this. This is with an RTX 4090 running with DLSS Ultra Performance mode being selected. Again, when I tested the patch, performance did improve a little bit, but honestly, with Ultra Performance DLSS being used, GPU usage was hovering at around 50% and my frame rate would be hovering around 120 FPS, trending up or down depending on the scene. Despite the quality modes not really impacting performance too much, and the game being quite frequently CPU bound, it's possibly not such a big deal in this game because it's going to run pretty well anyway. For example, if you have just 6 performance cores enabled on the 13900K with no hyperthreading and no E-cores, you're still going to be getting close to 120 FPS anyway, assuming your card can handle it. So for me anyway, that's more than sufficient for a game like this, which isn't exactly a Twitch-based shooter. I also want to mention that I haven't experienced any major crashes or glitches with the game. It's been very stable for me, and on the testing that I've done across multiple GPU configurations, performance has also been very stable as long as you're running settings, mostly the resolution and DLSS or FSR, that are going to fit that card level of performance. And yes, that is the big problem, because if you're turning the quality settings down from ultra to high, or let's say medium to low, again, you don't really claw back that many frames per second, so ultimately DLSS or FSR and your resolution options are going to be ultimately how you need to kind of adjust things to get the performance that you're going to want to play the game at. And this is also going to lead you to be very CPU bound on a high-end card like a 4090. I do suspect, however, that the game has a lot of room to improve via patches, and I would personally like to see frame generation with DLSS and FSR3 integrated in the future. I also want to mention that we'll be doing a lot more testing like this on the channel soon. Consider this video kind of like a proof of concept as I work out workflows and other things, and I will also of course be expanding the scope of the testing, particularly given there's going to be all of this new hardware that's going to be launching over the next several months. So not only will we be testing with additional CPUs as well as GPUs as well. With that said, hopefully you have found the video helpful and enjoyable. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.